What if the past of Indigenous North America was more complex than we usually hear, especially when it comes to love and relationships? Some oral traditions mention people later described as two-spirit taking on roles or clothing that did not fit the usual male-female pattern. A few warrior societies left stories of men whose partnerships were remembered with unusual closeness. Winter counts and certain songs seem to hint at households that did not follow typical marriage customs. Yet when missionaries and colonial officials recorded these practices, they often wrote with judgment, sometimes condemning them outright. Later, assimilation policies tried to erase them completely. But what do these scattered fragments really mean? Were they accepted expressions of same-sex intimacy, or simply misunderstood by outsiders and reshaped by translation? The evidence leaves us uncertain, open to interpretation and debate. What's your view? Share it in the comments and let me know what time you're watching. If questioning history excites you, subscribing is always your choice. They say history doesn't always shout its truths. Sometimes it only mumbles them in half-forgotten stories, scratched symbols, or the puzzled notes of explorers who didn't quite know what they were looking at. When you picture Indigenous North America before Europeans arrived, you might expect clear roles, rigid duties, everything neatly divided. But then you hear whispers, fragments of songs, myths about spirits who slipped between male and female figures, who tricked expectations, and suddenly the neatness fades. Were those whispers clues that love and identity could flow in ways that outsiders later refused to understand? You sit by the imagined fire of a longhouse, hearing an elder tell of Coyote the mischief maker. Sometimes he's male, sometimes female, sometimes both at once. You wonder why tell children such confusing tales unless they mirrored something real in the community. Perhaps these were playful lessons about flexibility, or perhaps they hinted at people whose lives didn't fit one box. The storytellers never say outright. They leave you dangling on a question mark as if nudging you to figure it out yourself. And then you glance into missionary journals, those dry, stern records meant to catalog sins. Hidden in their stiff handwriting are odd remarks about individuals who lived contrary to nature or who took peculiar companions. You imagine the priests, frowning, unable to put it clearly, but compelled to note it. Were they witnessing same-sex partnerships that local people didn't find unusual? The silence around those notes feels louder than the words themselves. Think about how languages hold clues. Many indigenous tongues had terms for people embodying both masculine and feminine qualities. Some words survive, though stripped of nuance when forced into English. Did those words describe sacred callings, everyday realities, or both at once? When a community has vocabulary for something, doesn't it suggest that the thing was recognized, perhaps even integrated? You're left tilting your head, like someone overhearing a conversation in a language you almost, but not quite, understand. Imagine daily life. A hunter comes back from the plains and shares a lodge with another man. Do neighbors gossip, or do they simply wave as if nothing unusual is happening? Two women farm together, raise nieces and nephews, and run a household. Was it seen as partnership friendship, or something more layered? You can't peek into their private laughter or whispered arguments, but the possibility sits there stubbornly resisting erasure. Even the sacred stories lean into the theme. In some traditions, you find tales of beings transformed switching between roles embodying balance. Among the Navajo figures, called Nadlihi, appear in oral history loosely translated as one who is transformed. Do these reflect spiritual archetypes or live people who carried such identities? The ambiguity leaves you circling around the same puzzle. Where does myth end and daily reality begin? And you can't help but compare it with today. Think of how, in modern times, people still argue about whether history has always included diverse loves. Yet here you are, looking at centuries-old hints that suggest it might have been right there, woven quietly into village life. Isn't it funny how we assume the past was stricter only to find signs it may have been more fluid than our present? Finally, consider the attitude of survival. In small communities where every hand mattered, planting, hunting, weaving, would it have made sense to ostracize those who simply loved differently? Maybe difference wasn't seen as a threat, but as another thread in the fabric. Or maybe there were conflicts we'll never fully uncover. The evidence won't decide for you. It only sits in fragments, leaving you staring at the spaces between them. In those myths of transformation, you start noticing something more than playful stories. Certain individuals in real villages seem to have carried that same shifting quality, and later generations would gather all these roles under a single phrase, two-spirit. Of course, that phrase itself is new chosen in 1990 at a gathering in Winnipeg, but the lives it points to appear in accounts far older. Lakota people spoke of the Winkte Navajo, of the Nadli Ojibwe, of the Agakwe. Each word belonged to its own world, holding meanings outsiders never fully grasped. Were they simple descriptions, or titles that carried weight, authority, even reverence? You picture daily life around a lodge. Someone wears clothing that mixes masculine and feminine elements, perhaps a shirt stitched with patterns not expected for their role, or hair tied in a way that blends styles. Nobody points or laughs. Instead, people carry on with cooking, carving, repairing tools. Could it be that this blending was not strange, but familiar, accepted as part of the rhythm of life? The silence of judgment in these imagined scenes almost says more than 1,000 written lines. Some stories suggest that these individuals were guided by visions. Perhaps in a dream, a spirit declared a path for them, a calling to walk between. From then on, they might serve as healers, mediators, or ceremonial leaders. Were they valued for their ability to see balance where others saw division? If disputes arose, did families bring them forward, trusting that someone with two spirits could see two sides? You can almost feel how such roles might emerge naturally in a community that prized harmony. The way outsiders wrote about them is telling. Anthropologists, fur traders, missionaries, each described people who lived as the other sex, often with discomfort. Yet buried in their notes are hints of respect shown by local communities, participation in rituals, authority in matchmaking, and family bonds recognized without punishment. If even hostile observers could not ignore their influence, doesn't that suggest these lives were not marginal, but central? Language itself becomes a clue. Why would so many nations create specific terms if the roles were insignificant? Vocabulary doesn't grow around nothing. Was the word spoken casually in marketplaces, or invoked only in sacred moments? Either way, the existence of so many names points to something recognized widely across cultures. Isn't it harder to deny what already has a word? Family life also leaves traces. Some two-spirit people reportedly formed partnerships, sometimes with men, sometimes with women. Were these unions celebrated, tolerated, or simply unremarkable? The outsiders who documented them usually reacted with surprise or disdain, but their shock may only reveal that local communities saw little need to explain. If anything, it was the visitors, not the villagers, who felt unsettled. Even art may hold reminders. Designs in beadwork or carvings sometimes depict figures with combined traits, symbols paired in unexpected ways. Were these mere decorations or subtle acknowledgments of lives that straddled categories? A pattern on a garment might look ordinary to modern eyes, but could once have been a quiet sign of recognition, a way of honoring those who live differently. When Indigenous activists reclaimed the term Two-Spirit in the late 20th century, they were not inventing something from thin air. They were gathering scattered fragments, piecing together what colonization had tried to erase. Was the word a revival or a new bridge linking past and present, perhaps both at once? In any case, the persistence of memory, the survival of names across nations, hints that these roles were never fully silenced, only waiting to be spoken again. If the names hint at something structured, the lodges themselves suggest where those lives unfolded day by day. Imagine stepping into a village at dusk, smoke curling from the tops of homes, people settling in with food and conversation. Inside some lodges, instead of the man and wife pairing you might expect, you find arrangements that leave you blinking twice. Two men living together, sharing tasks, raising children of relatives. Was this partnership? Was it kinship with an extra layer? The records never clarify, and that uncertainty pulls you in closer. Think of the rhythm of chores. One person goes hunting, the other stays back to mend tools or prepare hides. At night, they sit by the same fire, laughing, bickering, perhaps sharing inside jokes only couples develop. Did neighbors see this as strange? Or did they simply see two capable adults holding up their share of community work? Survival often leaves little room for labeling. There are stories of women two-pairs who planted together, shared harvests, raised nieces and nephews as their household. Outsiders tried to file them under spinsters or eccentric aunts. But were they actually life partners? It's the kind of gap where your imagination lingers, where those doorways filled with the same warmth you'd recognize in any home. The question hovers like smoke from a hearth. Sometimes journals give small glimpses. An explorer might jot down that two men occupy one lodge without judgment or with a raised eyebrow. Missionaries wrote of peculiar households they struggled to categorize, but behind those stiff words, you sense scenes of normalcy meals, shared responsibilities, divided lives woven together. Isn't it telling how the observers could not describe what was plainly before them without twisting it through their own discomfort? You compare it with something modern. Think of how today a pair of roommates might insist they're just friends, while neighbors speculate otherwise. Multiply that by centuries, and you start to sense how many lives went on quietly noticed but never named. It makes you wonder if gossip existed the same way in those villages, or if people were too busy grinding corn and repairing nets to care. And there is the spiritual angle again. In some nations, same-sex partners tied to two-spirit identities were thought to bring blessings. If a marriage needed a mediator, or if a ceremony needed someone who embodied balance, who better than a person living outside conventional pairings? The domestic life and the spiritual role may have overlapped, giving households a layer of respect rather than stigma. Was a union in such a lodge considered less, or was it perhaps valued differently? The question of children arises. Did these households raise orphans, take in relatives, or perhaps adopt in informal ways? If so, the village gained stable homes, extra hands, and nurturers. The outsiders who dismissed these unions as unproductive may have missed the obvious survival, thrived on cooperation, and families came in many forms. You picture a winter evening. Snow piles against the door. Firelight flickers across the walls. Two people share food from the same bowl. It could be any couple in any century, but here the partnership happens to fall outside categories the later world demanded. Is it love? Is it companionship? Is it something else entirely? You'll never get a neat answer, only the quiet certainty that such lodges existed, and life inside them unfolded much like any other messy tender, ordinary and extraordinary all at once. Every culture celebrates its warriors, and here the stories twist again. Picture a hunting party setting out at dawn, bows strung spears, tipped men walking side by side into the grasslands. Among them are pairs who seem inseparable partners in skill, partners in danger, perhaps partners in something unspoken. Was the battlefield not only a place of survival, but also a space where bonds deepened beyond camaraderie? You can't help but ask whether those stories of sworn companions hide more than friendship. Some early accounts describe warriors who refused to marry women, instead forming lasting attachments with fellow fighters. Were they honored for their loyalty or whispered about behind the fire? You imagine them sharing food, repairing each other's gear, standing shoulder to shoulder in raids. Did their connection make them stronger as a unit? Military history worldwide is full of pairs like this, from Greek hoplites to Japanese samurai. Could it be that indigenous North America had its own versions, simply never described in such explicit terms? Consider the Lakota Winkte again. While some filled ceremonial roles, others joined hunting and war parties. If a Winkte paired with another man, was it treated differently in that martial context? Reports from outsiders sometimes mention strange bonds between warriors, but what they found strange may have been common knowledge locally. Isn't it possible that courage on the field erased the need for explanation back in camp? You picture two men traveling for days, watching each other's backs, sleeping by the same fire, depending on each other for survival. Wouldn't that closeness naturally blur into something more? The anthropologists who later wrote of unnatural companionships may have been describing what the warriors themselves saw as the most natural bond of all. The absence of scandal in indigenous oral histories, contrasted with the scandalized tone of European notes, leaves you raising an eyebrow. Even the language of songs hints at layers. Some warrior chants mention my beloved companion phrases that translators struggled to interpret. Were those words metaphorical, like brother in arms, or literal expressions of affection? Without recordings, you can only wonder, yet the ambiguity itself suggests space for meanings wider than modern labels. Think of modern parallels. Soldiers today talk about the unbreakable brotherhood formed in combat. Some even admit those ties feel deeper than marriage. If that is true in our time, why should it not have been true centuries ago? The only difference may be that earlier societies allowed such bonds to exist without forcing them into neat categories, while outsiders tried to police them. And what about status A warrior who proved bravery might be free to choose a partner regardless of gender expectations? Was courage a kind of passport that made other questions irrelevant? If your arrow kept the village fed, or your shield saved lives in battle, did anyone care who sat beside you in the lodge afterward? Survival often trumps ideology, and that might explain why the fragments we have suggest less judgment than later laws imposed. You picture the return from battle drums, beating women, singing children, running to greet the fighters. Two men walk in together, carrying the same trophies, their steps perfectly in sync. Do the cheers rise for them both as a pair acknowledged even if unnamed? The journals remain quiet on such moments, but the silence feels suspicious, as though the writers chose not to say what everyone else already understood. Shift your gaze from the hunting grounds back to the fields and riverbanks where women carried just as much weight in the survival of their nations. Here, too, you catch glimpses of lives that didn't follow the script outsiders expected. Some women refused arranged marriages, instead choosing to live together, farm together, and manage households side by side. Were they dismissed later as helpers or spinsters? Or were they in truth partners whose choices baffled missionaries trying to explain them away? You picture two women in a small lodge, their hair braided neatly, their tools hanging on the walls. One returns from fishing, the other from the gardens, and they settle into the rhythm of their evening tasks. To outsiders, it may have looked like efficient cooperation. To those within the community, was it recognized as something deeper? If a child brought by relatives grew up under their care, did anyone question the arrangement, or was it simply another form of family? Some oral traditions hint at women who took on roles beyond domestic duties. They hunted road horses, even joined war parties. When such women partnered with other women, were they seen as exceptions or part of a broader pattern of flexibility? Anthropologists often used words like female husband to describe them, but isn't that just another attempt to cram indigenous realities into European molds? Consider the Iroquois Confederacy, where women held political influence as clan mothers. Could a woman who rejected male partnership still carry authority, making decisions for her people and raising her voice in council? If so, did that independence extend to choosing companions of her own sex without scandal? The fragments don't answer directly, but they nudge you toward the possibility. Imagine the way gossip might have sounded. Children giggling at the sight of two women hauling firewood together, a neighbor teasing them only to be silenced by an elder's shrug. Was the teasing playful acceptance rather than mockery? It feels plausible in societies where communal survival mattered more than rigid conformity. After all, if the work got done and the children were fed, what use was there in condemning how households were arranged? Even artwork leaves faint clues. Some carvings show paired female figures, their hands linked, or their tools mirrored. Were these artistic flourishes or subtle recognitions of partnerships that had no need for explanation? To a missionary's eye, it might have looked decorative. To the community, perhaps it carried meaning only insiders could read. The matter of ceremony raises another question. If a two-spirit individual could lead rituals, could women who partnered with women participate in sacred roles too? Was their independence a mark of spiritual calling as well as social freedom? Without direct testimony, you're left with the tantalizing possibility that such unions were not only tolerated, but folded into the sacred fabric of the community. And then you return to the outsider's words. They often seem bewildered, scribbling phrases like women acting as men, their surprise dripping from every line. Yet doesn't that reaction suggest that the women themselves were living openly enough to be noticed? The very fact that outsiders commented at all means these lives weren't hidden in shadows. They were visible, undeniable part of the landscape of village life, even if left undefined. The sound of drums echoes in your mind, steady and low, pulling you into ceremonies where roles were not merely social, but spiritual. In these spaces, you catch fragments of dancers whose clothing blends symbols, voices that sing in tones meant to bridge worlds, and the unmistakable sense that identity was tied to the sacred. Were two-spirit people called forward not in spite of their difference, but because of it? Some accounts suggest they held specific ritual responsibilities. A winkte among the Lakota might lead songs for weddings believed to bring balance and fertility. Among the Navajo, a Nadlihi could play an important role in healing ceremonies embodying harmony between male and female forces. Did communities turn to them in moments where equilibrium was vital? The repeated mentions across nations leave you wondering if their presence was considered necessary rather than optional. You picture a wedding, the fire-burning gifts, exchanged laughter rising through the night. A two-spirit person steps forward, chanting blessings that invoke unity. Was their authority based on a belief that only someone who carried both spirits could ensure the success of the union? The symbolism seems too deliberate to dismiss, and yet the records never quite spell it out. You're left hanging between suggestion and certainty. Even dances tell stories. Movements weaving masculine and feminine gestures together, steps that confuse outsiders but flow naturally to those who grew up with them. Were such performances forms of art or acts of spiritual affirmation? To European observers, they appeared strange or peculiar, but to the participants, did they embody the balance of the cosmos itself? The gulf between those perspectives yawns wide, daring you to choose which seems more plausible. Think about how communities honor their dead. In some nations, two-spirit individuals were given special burials, their graves marked in ways outsiders struggled to explain. Were these signs of reverence or simply cultural differences in mourning? The ambiguity lingers, but the fact that these burials stood out at all suggests significance rather than accident. It's tempting to compare with modern rituals. Today, people debate who has the right to bless, marry, or heal. Imagine explaining that centuries ago, communities deliberately placed those roles in the hands of individuals who embodied difference. Wouldn't that challenge assumptions about tradition being strictly conservative? Instead, tradition itself may have carried space for diversity all along. You can almost hear a child asking their parent why a certain person leads the songs. The answer might have been simple, because they walk with two spirits. No need for lengthy explanation, no panic, no shame, just a statement of fact. Was it really that ordinary? If so, the simplicity itself is what feels revolutionary in contrast to later centuries of condemnation. And then you return to the puzzle of evidence. Outsiders recorded these ceremonies through their own biases, noting details, twisting meanings. How much truth lies beneath their discomfort? Perhaps the clearest clue is their repeated emphasis on strangeness, which only underscores that Indigenous communities must have been comfortable enough with these roles to put them front and center in sacred moments. The drums fade, and suddenly the air feels colder, sharper, the moment when European boots first stepped onto these lands. Here, the story shifts. Everything you've glimpsed so far, through whispers and fragments, begins to clash with a worldview that had little room for ambiguity. Missionaries, traders, and soldiers arrived carrying their own categories of sin and law. And when they saw Indigenous people living outside those categories, their pens dripped with shock. Was this the beginning of erasure, or simply the first layer of misunderstanding that grew heavier with time? Consider the reports of Spanish friars in the Southwest. Some described men in women's clothes, or women who lived as men with tones of horror. They called them sodomites, sinners, abominations, words meant to condemn rather than understand. Yet behind those harsh terms, you can still glimpse what they were describing. People living openly, visibly part of their communities. Isn't it telling that the friars noticed them so quickly? That visibility itself suggests they weren't hidden or shamed until the outsiders declared them so. English and French colonists weren't much different. Traders in the Great Lakes region wrote of peculiar customs they could not quite categorize. Missionaries tried to force conversions, labeling two-spirit people as deviants. Did they realize they were confronting systems older and more resilient than their own doctrines? Or did their certainty blind them to what was really happening before their eyes? Imagine the awkward encounters. A missionary asks a question about marriage, expecting a simple answer. The villager points to a household of 2 men or 2 women. The missionary frowns, scribbles something judgmental in his notebook, and moves on. Meanwhile, life in the village continues unchanged. For a time at least. But once laws and punishments followed, did that continuity survive? Or did people begin to hide, knowing that being visible now carried danger? Colonial governments tightened the screws. As Christianity spread, indigenous nations were pressured to adopt European legal codes. Behavior once woven into community fabric became criminalized. Was this transformation swift or gradual, as elders tried to protect their traditions while younger generations grew up under new rules? The written records never capture the quiet negotiations inside families, the whispered warnings to children, the sorrow of identities suddenly declared illegal. Think of the power imbalance. Europeans arrived with weapons diseases and a sense of superiority. They weren't just disapproving. They enforced their disapproval with law force and punishment. What had once been a role respected in ceremonies might now draw ridicule or violence. Isn't it chilling how quickly perception can change? When an empire decides it knows better, you might compare it with modern workplaces that suddenly ban traditions or languages because they don't fit corporate culture. Overnight, what was normal becomes suspect. For indigenous communities, the arrival of colonists meant that the very people once called upon for blessings were now labeled shameful. That's more than cultural loss. It's cultural inversion, a complete flipping of meaning. And yet, in the missionary journals, the more they condemned, the more evidence they left behind. Without meaning to, they preserved proof that these roles existed. Every outraged line becomes a reluctant testimony, a breadcrumb pointing back to lives that refuse to fit imported boxes. Once those laws and judgments took root, the story doesn't go silent. It just shifts underground. You can almost sense families closing ranks, shielding relatives who no longer felt safe in the open. Some two-spirit people were forced into marriages they didn't want, or into hiding their roles during ceremonies. Did they whisper their songs only in private, waiting for safe ears? Or did communities quietly keep them in their place of honor, while pretending otherwise to missionaries? The record leaves gaps, and in those gaps, you glimpse strategies of survival. There are accounts of elders remembering traditions long after suppression began. They speak of uncles or aunts who lived differently, whose presence was both known and respected. even if never discussed with outsiders. Was this silence an act of shame, or was it protection, a way of keeping something sacred from being torn apart by colonial eyes? You wonder whether secrecy itself became a form of resistance. Think of boarding schools built to erase indigenous languages, clothing, and customs. Students were stripped of their hair, their clothes, even their names. In those environments, what chance did a two-spirit child have to express themselves? And yet whispers persist of students who found each other, who created hidden networks of recognition. Could it be that even under the harshest surveillance difference found ways to survive? It helps to imagine the resilience of memory. A grandmother passing down a story in hushed tones, a pattern in beadwork, carrying meanings only family members understand, a ritual gesture performed quietly when outsiders weren't watching. These fragments suggest that erasure was never complete, that identity lingered in places colonization couldn't fully reach. Isn't it often the case that what cannot be spoken finds other ways to live? Consider the parallels in modern life. People under repressive regimes often keep traditions alive behind closed doors, teaching children to hold both the public face and the private truth. Could indigenous communities have done the same with two-spirit roles, masking them outwardly while nurturing them inwardly? If so, survival didn't mean disappearance, but adaptation. Resistance wasn't always quiet either. Some records hint at open defiance individuals who refused to change, who lived visibly even when punished. Were they seen as stubborn rebels or as keepers of tradition in its truest form? Perhaps both. Every act of refusal added another thread of survival to the tapestry, even if it cost dearly. By the 20th century, many outside observers declared these roles extinct. But the silence they mistook for absence may have been carefully cultivated presence. Communities remembered, even if they pretended not to. Isn't that the irony, that the very effort to erase something may have ensured its survival in memory, precisely because it became something to guard? You can almost hear the tension in those decades. Silence in public, whispers in private memories, stitched into blankets, stories tucked into lullabies. It's not the loud kind of resistance history books usually record, but it may be the kind that kept enough embers alive for revival to be possible later. Through the 19th and early 20th centuries, those embers dimmed, but never died. Boarding schools grew stricter, government agents enforced regulations, and families learned to keep certain truths quiet. If a child showed signs of walking a path, once recognized as two-spirit, what happened then? Were they scolded into silence or quietly protected within the household? Some survivors recall teachers punishing them for how they dressed or spoke, while relatives whispered encouragement at night. Isn't it striking how two realities could exist under the same roof? One for survival, the other for memory. You hear stories of children taken far from home, stripped of their language and clothing. Some were told their traditions were evil, their identities sinful. Yet among themselves, students found ways to resist trading words in their languages, creating secret signals, perhaps even recognizing each other as kindred spirits. Did friendships form in those dormitories that outsiders never noticed? And did those friendships carry echoes of older patterns, hidden but enduring? Meanwhile, mainstream society painted a picture of disappearance. Anthropologists wrote in past tense, claiming two-spirit roles had vanished. Missionaries congratulated themselves on stamping out deviance. But the oral histories contradict that neat story. Elders spoke of relatives who lived differently, sometimes with affection, sometimes with caution, but always with recognition. Could it be that the very claim of extinction was a mask, while the reality carried on in subtler ways? Consider the 1950s and 60s, when Indigenous people faced pressure to assimilate into urban life. Those who moved to cities often hid their identities, yet they also encountered others like themselves. Imagine the small sparks of recognition at a dance hall or in a neighborhood gathering. Did they realize they were not alone, that what they carried inside had roots deeper than colonial categories? The fragments of oral testimony suggest exactly that. Think of modern parallels, immigrant families passing down recipes or songs, even while insisting their children speak the dominant language. The public face changes, but the private rituals endure. For two-spirit identities, endurance might have meant continuing in secret in gestures too small for outsiders to catch. Isn't it often the case that what looks invisible from the outside is vibrant on the inside? By the late 20th century, activism began to stir. Indigenous LGBTQ+ voices found each other sharing stories of feeling both erased and resilient. They looked back at the old words, Winkte Nadlihi Agokwe, and recognized themselves. Was this rediscovery a surprise? Or had the memory been waiting all along, carefully kept by families who refused to let it die? You imagine an elder at a kitchen table telling a grandchild about an uncle who never married a woman, or an aunt who hunted and farmed with another woman. The grandchild listens eyes wide, realizing this isn't a modern invention, but part of a much older story. How many such conversations took place quietly outside the view of history books, and so the echoes of those roles carried into modern times, muted but never gone, setting the stage for revival. The silence was heavy, but within it lay seeds that would grow again once the conditions shifted. And then, almost like a drumbeat returning after a long silence, voices rose again. The year was 1990 in Winnipeg, when Indigenous activists gathered and chose the term Two-Spirit. It wasn't just a label. It was a reclamation, a declaration that the old words scattered across nations still had life. Was this moment a revival, or had the roots always been there, waiting for sunlight? You can almost feel the mix of relief and pride in that choice, as if generations of whispers suddenly turned into a chorus. From that point, stories long hidden began to surface. Elders shared memories of relatives who lived differently. Young people began to call themselves Two-Spirit, claiming both their Indigenous heritage and their place in modern LGBTQ+ movements. Did they see themselves as reconnecting with sacred traditions or carving out new ones, perhaps both at once? The ambiguity doesn't diminish the power. If anything, it enriches it. Festivals and powwows began to include Two-Spirit circles, spaces where people could dance, sing, and pray openly. Imagine the colors regalia that blends masculine and feminine designs, movements that flow across categories outsiders once insisted were rigid. To those watching, was it a political statement, a spiritual act, or simply a celebration of being alive? The answer shifts depending on who you ask, but the energy pulses the same. Think about the courage it takes to stand in those circles after centuries of silence. Young Two-Spirit people today often speak of facing rejection, not only from mainstream society, but sometimes from within their own communities where colonial attitudes still linger. Yet each public dance, each gathering chips away at that inherited shame. Isn't it remarkable how resilience becomes visible, not just whispered. When people claim space like this, art has become a tool of revival too. Painters, poets, and filmmakers weave old stories with new experiences. Beadwork, once done in secret, now gleams proudly at cultural fairs. Could it be that creativity itself has always been the language of survival, carrying memory through color, sound, and symbol? You can almost see how every stitch, every word, is another act of reclamation. Modern activism brings its own questions. Some two-spirit people align with broader LGBTQ+ movements, while others emphasize that their identity is not simply about sexuality or gender, but about sacred responsibility. Is the term stretching too far? Or is it doing exactly what it's meant to, holding together many truths at once? The debates themselves prove how alive the concept is no longer confined to anthropologists' footnotes. You imagine a child today growing up hearing the word two-spirit not as an insult, but as a blessing. They see dancers in powwows, read books by Indigenous authors, watch films that honor their heritage. Will they feel less alone than their grandparents did? Will they sense the continuity, fragile yet unbroken, that runs from ancient lodges through centuries of suppression into today's revival? And maybe the biggest question of all, what does it mean for the future when communities reclaim not only their land and languages, but also their identities in all their complexity? The whispers that once seemed on the verge of vanishing now echo loudly, reminding anyone listening that history was never as simple as outsiders tried to make it. The untold lives of two-spirit people remind you that Indigenous North America carried layers of identity far richer than colonial pens ever admitted. Families, ceremonies, and stories all reveal communities built on resilience, balance, and survival. Yet survival was never only spiritual or domestic. It was also defended with bows, lances, and sheer courage. For every healer or storyteller, there were warriors whose names carried weight across plains and forests, fighters so skilled that even their enemies told tales in awe. And so, the whispers of identity now give way to the thunder of battle, the most feared warriors of Indigenous North America. You wake to the oldest sound of danger, not metal clashing, but branches breathing water, muttering under a canoe footsteps that learn your rhythm and step between it. No steel glints anywhere, yet your pulse climbs, because an entire continent teaches war without a single sword in sight. You move through a map that fights back. Eastern forests muffle arrows and reward the patient ambush. Wetlands knit together like traps, perfect for canoes that appear and vanish among the cattails. High plains open into sightlines so long you read intention by dust, and deserts turn distance into a weapon against anyone who underestimates thirst. Before Europeans unload steel gunpowder and horses into the story warfare, here already runs like a second bloodstream. It isn't chaos. It has rules, seasons, and reasons. Some fights ignite over hunting grounds and river crossings, some over trade routes for stone shells and native copper, some because kin has been harmed, and grief demands an answer. You hear of mourning wars, when a community hollowed by loss seeks captives to fill the empty places at the hearth. Weapons grow from what the land gives. Bows are short for forest draw, yet strong enough to punch through leather, their strings spun from sinew that hums when you test it. Atlatls, the old dart throwers, still ride in toolkits where open space favors long casts. Spears balance for the rush or a quick throw from a canoe's gunwale. War clubs curve like lightning ball-headed stones cradled in wood-beaked edges carved to break flat blades shaped from elk antler when stone runs scarce. Protection is a conversation, not a wall. Shields are rawhide thickened by smoke and sun, or layered wood bound with fiber light enough to move as you move. Armor appears where you might not expect. Slats of cedar sewn to garments along the northwest coast sticks, and bark woven to turn aside a thrust without turning a person into a statue. The point is never invincibility. The point is motion under pressure. Training shows up in childhood the way balance shows up in walking. You practice the quiet step in leaf litter because deer hear you otherwise. You memorize the gossip of birds, which becomes an early warning system if you listen long enough. You learn to travel light to cache food, to leave nothing shiny that tells a stranger where you have passed. And you learn the art of not getting seen, which might be the sharpest blade anyone carries. Villages think about defense the way you think about smoke alarms. Palisades rise rows of logs set shoulder to shoulder, sometimes doubled, sometimes ringed by ditches. Gateways turn into choke points, and towers give angles that punish anyone in the open. When danger approaches, fires drop to coals. Children know where to run, and lookouts count seconds by the beat of their own breath. Diplomacy is not a footnote. It is another kind of weapon. You sit in councils that stretch longer than your patience, where the right belt of wampum speaks more loudly than a shout. Alliances knit former enemies into relatives by agreement, and peace needs tending the way a fire needs wood. The most feared fighters are often those whose leaders can make a dozen communities move as a single thought. The economy of war doesn't run on coin. It runs on people, promises, and proof. Proof looks like a trophy, taken a story, earned a scar you let the elders inspect. In some places, counting coup, touching an enemy, and getting away outranks killing because it measures nerve and control. Prestige isn't empty. It feeds marriages, unlocks trade, and convinces neighbors that your camp is a bad place to test. Would you dare try your luck after hearing those stories passed around a fire tactics favor, the student of terrain? Night raids drift in like weather. Ambush lines lean along a river bend, while scouts post two bends upstream to read your wake. Feigned retreats tempt you into sprinting the last yards right where the ground softens and your ankles betray you. Ever tiptoed to the kitchen at midnight and hit the one squeaky board? Same principle, just with higher stakes. Food is strategy disguised as lunch. You carry dense travel rations pressed from dried meat and fat because speed is its own kind of armor. Fires are small, brief and careful about smoke. Canoes are the pickup trucks of waterways built for silence, loaded for quick lifts, patched with pine pitch that smells like a story even before the sun warms it. On foot, you pace by songs, landmarks, and the curve of hills you could draw with your eyes closed. Ritual is preparation, not superstition. You fast to steady the mind. You paint your face to step into the role you were asked to fill. Songs stitched to memory keep fingers from shaking the arrow off the string. Dreams matter. A vision might tell you which path to take, which fight to avoid, and which friend to trust when everyone insists they're fine. Do you keep a small pre-game ritual before an interview or exam? Imagine that with elders watching and consequences that ripple through families, not just a report card. Archaeology leaves breadcrumb proof. You find palisade post holes around mound towns, burn lines on timbers, caches of points hidden like savings, and embedded arrowheads in burials that speak of disciplined volleys. You don't need a chronicle written in Latin to recognize a place that learned the hard arithmetic of defense. Stories carry the rest. You hear of runners who could fold 50 miles into a day of canoes that skimmed night water, of warriors who memorized every hollow log and used them as ladders over palisade walls. Are the stories embellished naturally? Are they useful? Absolutely, because they teach what a body can be trained to do when community expects excellence and survival rewards it. You also notice what isn't here. No massed formations wheeling on trumpet calls. No polished phalanx grinding forward under a single banner. Warfare is intimate, local, relational. It is a geography exam written in footprints and river eddies, and the people who ace it are the ones who listen hardest to place. Fear grows less from sheer numbers and more from the feeling that the landscape itself has chosen a side. Night thickens over the river. You rub tallow into the bowstring, test the knock-by feel, and count the spaces between frog calls. A reed ticks once, then settles. You keep your heel off the route you mapped at dusk and wait for the water to tell you what moves first. What moves first is your hand. The tools decide the rhythm long before any shout does. You pinch the knock again, then let the bow settle, because here the materials are the real tactician's wood that remembers which way it grew animal sinew, that keeps a private conversation with humidity stone, that breaks along laws older than any treaty. You start with the bow because it's the quiet boss. In deep woods, length isn't prestige. Maneuverability is. Self bows, one piece of wood stays short enough to slip past brush, yet thick through the grip, so power doesn't leak. Osage orange makes a favorite stave where it grows. If you've ever heard folks call it bois d'arc, you've already learned a micro lesson in reputation by material. Hickory and ash step in where Osage can't, and out west you find yew that springs back like it was paid to. When a bow needs more backbone, sinew gets glued to the back, with hide glue shrinking as it dries, adding that extra snap you feel in your palm. No fancy carbon limbs, just tendon and patience, and somehow it keeps throwing arrows on a damp morning. Strings talk back to weather. Sinew sings until rain makes it moody. Rawhide stiffens, unless coddled, and plant fibers behave like coworkers who quietly do the job. You rub tallow or grease and check twist by muscle memory and never leave a string in the sun unless you enjoy disappointment. Arrow shafts shift by region, river cane in the southeast light and straight. Hardwood shoots further north heat, straightened across a knee. Hollow reeds in dry country when weight and wind need a compromise. Fletching turkey feathers when you can. Goosehawk and whatever reliable flight you can earn when you can't. A dab of pitch, a rap of sinew, and the feather's soft whisper becomes spin and stability in the dark. Points are a study in choices under pressure. Chert flint, chalcedony quartzite, whatever breaks, with a predictable conchoidal grin, gets napped into barbed persuasion. Obsidian, where volcanic glass exists, slices with a delicacy that would make a surgeon nod, even if you're not handing it a diploma. Heat-treating stone, baking it low and slow, sweetens the fracture, a trick you don't discover by accident. Later metal trade heads spread like gossip. But here your pocket inventory still clicks with stone and bone, and you know exactly how each will leave the bow. If the bow is king, the atlatl is a retired champion that still wins bar bets. A throwing board extends your arm, the dart flexes, and physics turns grace into range. Arctic hunters keep it alive because seals and water don't care about trends. Puebloan memory holds its lessons. In some places, it rides alongside the bow, like a reliable uncle who only shows up when it counts. Ever tried skipping a rock and felt it catch and zing? Scale that feeling up. Add a hooked spur and a 6-foot dart, and you begin to understand why the atlatl refuses extinction. Now, put a club in your palm and notice how the conversation changes. In the Great Lakes and Northeast, a war club might swell into a stone-headed knot that lands like a sentence ending. Some curve forward into that beaked profile antler, or carved wood thrusting out like a hooked crescent built to break resolve more than just bone. Mississippian-style maces pecked and ground from tough stone show up in the archaeological lineup as proof that ceremony and combat sometimes shared the same tool rack. Later, the gunstock club, shaped like the shoulder of a musket, enters the scene, not as cosplay, but as smart ergonomics. A lever, a blade inset an angle that promises leverage in close quarters. Pick one up, and your wrist understands immediately. Spears and lances track the story of distance. On foot, in thick country, a short, thrusting spear asks you to commit. From a canoe, a leaf-shaped head lands sure when water turns slippery. On horse, after horses arrive, the lance becomes a painter's brush that writes moving geometry in the air. Fire-hardening tips, socketing stone blades, or using bone. An antler, where stone runs scarce. Each choice reflects what the land has on the shelf. And yes, a good spear throws, if you must, but you measure that throw against whether you'll ever see the spear again. Shields are moving doors. Plains, rawhide shields, buffalo hide, thick and shaped over a form-balanced lightness with a surprising stubbornness against arrows. Paint isn't decoration so much as contract designs that remind the arm to be brave stories, that remember the moments a shield already kept. In wetter places, layered bark and wood become portable walls. In canoe country, a shield is small enough to play both blocker and paddle in a pinch, if your timing is good and your priorities are straight. Armor appears where people have time, material, and reason. Along the northwest coast, cedar slat armor, horizontal strips laced into a vest, takes the bite out of incoming trouble without turning you into furniture. Helmets carved from hardwood carry crests that announce identity before the first paddle stroke lands. Elsewhere, layered hides or woven stick jackets add margins to a human silhouette. Is any of this plate mail? No. But the point is still to move after being hit, not to pose like a statue in a courtyard. Knives live everywhere because everything needs cutting. Stone blades ride in sheaths, bone splinters, into awls that punch through hide antler, becomes hafts and handles that warm in the hand. Scrapers, gravers, drills, polishers, your toolkit sounds like a tiny workshop when you set it down. You bind edges with sinew and glue guard seams with pitch and keep a low fire going because adhesive is a living thing with rules. Tool making itself is training for conflict. You strike flakes from a core, each hit judged by the angle between your platform and your goal. You abrade edges so the next blow lands where you intended. Think of it as roughing in a sketch before ink. Pecks and grinds shape hard stone for hours that steel the ego and feed the will. Heat straightening shafts over coals demands a relax bend cool rhythm, the same cadence you'll use later when breath controls an arrow's launch. Sound matters more than you'd guess. A bow that creaks tells on you. A club that whistles teaches your enemy to duck earlier next time. A shield that thumps true reassures the elbow. Even the rattle of spare points in a pouch gets wrapped in cloth, because nothing ruins surprise like your own pockets applauding. Have you ever tried to open a snack in a quiet room and the wrapper sounds like thunder? Same energy, higher stakes. Psychology rides shotgun with physics. A painted face isn't just flair. It's an on switch that locks you into role. feathers, scalps taken in some traditions, medicine bundles, carved totems, all of these extend a warrior silhouette into story. But the hardware still has to earn its keep. You can't paint fear into a club swing that misses time after time. You practice until wood memory fuses with body memory, and the miss grows rare. Here and there, specific names surface like stepping stones. The Osage develop a bow reputation so strong that even neighbors talk about Osage bows, the way runners talk about a trusted shoe model. Along the northern coast, Tlingit and Haida artisans shape helmets and slat armor that visitors sketch because they don't expect to see wood look like moving metal. Artist observers, such as George Catlin, later scribble notes about buffalo hide shields, turning arrows, and while you hold a grain of salt for any outsider's astonishment, you also see how often the material logic checks out. Modern comparisons help, but only if they behave. Think ultralight backpacking, where every ounce begs for justification. You trim fletching because crosswinds today aren't the same as yesterday's. You pick a shorter bow, not because it's cool, but because brush grabs longer limbs with spite. You carry two strings, like someone carries a spare phone charger because trouble loves a frayed cord. Sometimes you ask a practical, unfancy question. What can I fix in the field? Stone points you can resharpen with a bit of grit and time. Sinew you can rewrap if it loosens. Wood you can warm and straighten over coals. The repair manual lives in your hands, not in a warehouse. If a tool insists on special treatment you can't provide in the rain, the tool doesn't get invited. You return to the riverbank inventory without speaking bow, heavy enough to matter arrows tuned to the season's air club riding the hip knife, where fingers find it blind, a packet of pitch and sinew, waiting for whatever the night asks next. You don't put the tools down so much as you put the mask on. And the mask doesn't have to be wood. Sometimes it's the first wet line you drag across your cheek with a fingertip that smells faintly of bear fat and charcoal. The face you wear to fetch water is not the face you wear to be seen by an enemy. Paint becomes a switch. You flip away to remind your body what job is at hand without giving a speech to your nerves. Color speaks in dialects. Meanings aren't one size fits all. They shift by nation, by family, even by the person who woke from a certain dream. Black might recall the night's steadiness to one group, red the spark of life to another, white the calm of bone to a third. What repeats is the intent high contrast shapes that break the familiar contours of a human face lines, that sharpen cheekbones into angles, circles that make eyes look wider than they are, and stripes that read like exclamation marks from 20 paces. Hair joins the theater. A shaved crown with a braid down the back, a crest stiffened with grease feathers, signaling status or past deeds. The silhouette you present at dawn is a message before you open your mouth. You notice how even a small change, a lock brought forward, a tuft tied high, alters how tall, how fast, how stubborn you appear when someone glances up in fear and has to decide what they're looking at. Do you remember the first time you tried on a formal suit and stood a little straighter without meaning to? Same principle, different stakes. Then come the true masks, carved, painted, sometimes inlaid where they belong. On the northwest coast, a helmet can be a snarling ancestor's face, cedar shaped so strong it turns an arrow and feels like wearing a story on your skull. Tlingit and Haida warriors paddle with those crests. Forward eyes narrowed behind slits, the prow of the canoe echoing the jawline of the mask so the whole craft looks alive. A transformation mask might open to reveal a second visage, a surprise inside the surprise, because confusion is as useful as any blade when the first seconds of contact decide who moves last. Sound is a weapon you can't pick up, but you can aim. Plains warriors ride with bone whistles that cut the air in a high steady thread you feel more than hear. In forests, a rattle shaken once becomes punctuation that stops a foot mid-step. Drum beats aren't just for ceremony. A single beat in the dark can serve as a heartbeat. The group rallies too, while a sudden chorus of yips yells and deep-throated cries multiplies your numbers inside an enemy's mind. Open a door to a crowded room and hear everyone speak at once. That sensory overload is the point delivered at the worst possible moment for whoever isn't ready. Movement learns from predators. You've watched wolves ghost along a tree line until deer forget to be nervous. You borrow that glide. You've seen a hawk hold still then drop like punctuation. You borrow that suddenness. Feints become handwriting, a step forward that means look here, followed by the strike that says no, look there. Among horse peoples, after horses arrive, shawls and robes flare to make riders look larger, while dust kicked up by a few can impersonate an army for the length of a heartbeat. We've all fallen for a magician's misdirection. Consider this, the field version with galloping. Deception travels light. Dummy fires set along a ridge pull eyes uphill while your feet go low. A canoe left drifting around a bend suggests a launch, not an ambush, and you let it play the role while you stay under alder shade. Footprints can be edited with a cedar bough sweep that erases or with deliberate overlaps that manufacture confusion. One recorded tricks uses mirrored tracks, heels, where toes should be to suggest a retreat when you're actually closing in. And you admire the petty genius in that because panic loves a good rumor. Ritual is a tuning fork. Sweat lodge heat steams doubt out through skin. Fasting clears the chatter off thought. And certain songs act like a code you and your crew all remember without asking who started it. Some groups drink a bitter tea as a purge and a promise, a way to say we've tested ourselves before the trouble, not after. Medicine bundles ride along a claw, a carved piece, a belt threaded with stories. Whether you call it placebo or prayer, it tightens the grip, just enough that the first arrow leaves the string straight instead of crooked. Psychology also lives in how close you risk getting. Counting coup, touching an enemy, and getting away turns nerve into a scoreboard. Everyone respects, not because harm is the goal, but because control is. Imagine tapping the shoulder of the person who's been chasing you and walking off unhurried. The embarrassment writes its own legend, and legends travel faster than paddles. Prestige isn't vanity here, it's function. A warrior known for courage can negotiate harder, recruit easier, and sometimes prevent fights that a nervous leader would blunder into. Shields and shirts become billboards for memory. A plain shield painted with a vision, say a circle, and a figure the dream insisted on reminds the arm what story it belongs to every time the rawhide twangs. Among river and coast peoples, armor slats might carry carved motifs that tell anyone watching, these are the ones who arrived the last time you tried this. Outsiders sometimes mistake decoration for flourish. You've already learned it's both symbol and instruction, a way to keep behavior inside the rails long after the initial adrenaline has burned off. Numbers can be staged. 10 can masquerade as 30 if they arrive from 3 angles with 3 distinct voices, bass mid-treble, so a listener can't stack them into one group. At night, the placement of breathing matters. Spacing out bedrolls and coughs suggests a camp larger than it is, which might cool a hothead looking for bravery. Daylight has its math, as well as skirmish line that curves, slightly looks longer, and shadows thrown by high crests, stretched just enough that a watcher recalculates with trembling optimism you have no intention of rewarding. Not every tactic shrieks. Silence itself builds dread. You've learned how the forest sounds when nothing human is near, and how it flips when something is watching. Keeping the soundscape perfectly normal as you approach is a skill you practice like a musician practicing scales. A loon call at the wrong hour means this isn't right, but a loon call at the right hour is just a loon, which is why mimicry gets rehearsed. The point is to let fear grow in the other person's imagination while you stay busy doing ordinary things, will breathing, stepping, aiming. Sometimes modern life hands you neat comparisons. Teams paint their faces on game day. Gym playlists pump courage. Stage lighting sculpts cheekbones. So a performer looks more myth than person. You recognize the same toolkit here, older, leaner, unsponsored. A comedian knows to pause before the punchline. You learn to hold still exactly one beat before contact. So the mind across from you misfires and chooses wrong. Little edges stack into big outcomes, and the most dreaded fighters are often the best arrangers of small, repeatable edges. You finish by looking at your own reflection, the still part in a puddle between cattails. The lines you've drawn don't make you someone else. They make you the version of yourself that knows what to do when the cattails rustle twice instead of once, when a paddle dips at the wrong cadence, when an owl calls and another owl answers in a voice a little too tidy. You steady the bow in the shadow your mask throws and listen for the breath you've trained to hear. Fear travels faster than arrows when a whole league moves like one mind, and tonight you sit where that mind gathers under the dark ribs of a longhouse while the central fire throws slow light onto belts of shell that remember every promise anyone dared to make. You listen before you speak, because Haudenosaunee politics is an endurance sport. 5 nations: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca hold their places like constellations with the Onondaga, keeping the central fire and the council's memory. Later, a 6th star, the Tuscarora, will rise and join them, but your ears right now tune to elders who can measure a leader, not by volume, but by how his words settle. Clan mothers sit with authority that isn't ceremonial. Choose the sachems, depose the ones who forget the people, and you learn quickly that bravado has a short shelf life when the women who feed the league also guard its future. Ever see a meeting where the quiet person actually runs the room? That, the law they live by, is called the Great Law of Peace, and you can feel it in the cadence of the council. Wampum belts aren't jewelry. They're data storage in beads. Treaties, griefs, obligations. Each pattern, a memory palace that a trained speaker unlocks by touch. When the belts come out, voices soften because the past is literally in someone's hands, and it is impolite to interrupt a belt doing its job. But peace in here does not mean softness out there. Step into the trees at dawn and meet the league's other voice. Mohawk scouts the eastern door, move like they have keys to the trail. Oneida and Cayuga carry the mid-country like steady hands on a paddle. Seneca guardians of the western door know the long roads and the last light. The Onondaga, keepers of counsel, also keep the map of who is where and why. You fall in with a war party and learn Rule 1, you are never the loudest thing in the forest. Rule 2, you only fight when the ground agrees to help. Ambush is choreography. Advance in files that breathe together, let the first man become the forest's face, and keep the second man ready to be the forest's answer. You place a decoy where a deer trail crosses a human habit, leave a hint of prints that pull eyes down and stack real movement in the edge of sight, where panic reads shadows as people. When contact starts, the opening volley is posture and punctuation, not chaos. Then the retreat that is not a retreat begins a curl that invites pursuit into a bend of ground already measured at dusk. Do you know that one alley behind your apartment where you'd never run blind? Same lesson, memorized in bark and slope. Reputation does half the work. Iroquois is what many neighbors call them. Haudenosaunee is the name they call themselves, people of the Longhouse, and the name alone signals structure. Traders at river posts swap stories about distances covered in a single moon, about villages that relocate like a well-rehearsed play, about diplomacy that turns enemies into relatives by treaty faster than outsiders can count beads. Some tales are stretched. Campfire smoke loves drama. But the core gets confirmed the hard way by those who try to test it and do not like the exam. Economies bend around fur, and the League bends the economies. Dutch traders at the river ports don't hand out favors. They barter. The League pays attention to math. Firearms arrive by trade earlier here than in many places, not as magic wands, but as new tools, with new rules slow to load, at first awkward, when wet loud enough to warp tactics until everyone learns how to hide the first shot and vanish before the second. You witness the clever part. The League learns to use the new, while keeping the old bows for silence guns, for shock alliances for reach. Who says you can't run new software on old hardware if you understand the operating system? Conflicts spiral because trade routes are veins and every nation wants good circulation. The Beaver Wars, what later storytellers will call this era, draw in neighbors who did not ask to be drawn Wendat, to the North Erie, to the west Susquehannock, farther south and out toward the lakes, the neutral and others who prefer quiet but cannot keep it. Missionaries write accounts full of surprise. You read them carefully, knowing surprise is a poor teacher, but still useful as a mirror, showing what outsiders fail to see: coordination, logistics, and a willingness to stop when the belts say stop. Mourning matters here in a way that outsiders miss. Loss demands action, a condolence ceremony to steady the hearts. Then sometimes a war whose purpose is not annihilation, but replacement. Captives can be adopted to fill a family's empty place at the hearth, their old names softened by new kin. Violence exists, yes, but the logic is social repair as much as scorekeeping, and that logic confuses enemies who only understand one kind of victory. Would you fight differently if the goal was to make your household whole rather than simply to win a headline? Villages are not castles, yet they defend like them. Palisades rib. The perimeter ditches complicate approaches, and gate systems demand that an attacker commit in a narrow space where angles go bad quickly. Agriculture, corn, beans, squash, feeds a surplus that lets the League campaign with full stomachs and return to stores that buffer bad seasons. Logistics sounds boring until you march hungry. Here, it's an art, and the Longhouse stores what speeches cannot. Diplomacy is the League's long-range weapon. Covenant chain is the phrase that will knot the Haudenosaunee to English interest for a long stretch, links polished by councils, gifts, and mutual convenience. When the chain shines, trade flows, and border fires stay low. When neglect dulls, its sparks leap. You sit in one of those meetings and watch a speaker pick up a metaphor like a tool buffet and set it back down, gleaming enough that even a tired official nods. Meanwhile, another delegation has already gone west to mend a fence with someone else. If you've ever watched a great point guard control a game without shooting much, you've seen the same genius. Names rise with seasons. Ayunwatha Hiawatha stands in the memory of how peace was braided in the first place, whether you tell the story with a literal peacemaker or with a metaphor strong enough to behave like a person. Generations later, Thayendanegea Joseph Brant will move between languages and empires with a posture that says, I belong in all these rooms. And whether you agree with his choices or not, you recognize the League's habit of producing leaders who travel as easily as they fight. Technology adapts without losing manners. A musket gets cut down and decorated so it balances in the crook of an arm like it belongs there. Powder and lead ride in pouches that look like they've always existed. Yet the bow does not leave the story, partly because stealth never goes out of style, and partly because a stringed weapon that grew from your own hands feels different when you must depend on it in rain. Shields and armor aren't daily wear in this forested theater, but when a raid expects close work rawhide and wood appear, and you see the same equation you saw before, protection that permits motion beats heavy bravado every time. If you want a modern comparison, consider a well-coached team that practices scenarios until they can't get them wrong: late game press, sideline, out of bounds, overtime possession. The League practices diplomacy the same way, practices ambush the same way, practices grief the same way. That rehearsal builds the kind of confidence opponents mislabel as arrogance until the moment it isn't. By the time you step back into the night, the council has not ended. It has paused like a river that decides to move under ice instead of over it. You feel how the belts still hum on the wall, how the doors of the longhouse east and west hold their symbolic vigilance, how the forest outside leans in as if it too is part of the quorum. You settle your pack. Listen for the soft adjust of feet beyond the palisade and match your breath to the quiet shape the League prefers when it moves. Out where forests fall away to grass without fences, your feet leave the longhouse boards for a pony's back, and the world suddenly has no corners to hide in. Wind comes clean across the southern plains, and fear here learns a new accent, the kind that arrives at a gallop and vanishes in dust before your brain catches up. Horses are the hinge. Brought north and west by Spanish stock, loosed wider after uprisings and escapes, they multiply on grass like sparks in straw. Shoshonean speakers drift south, discover what a small, tough horse can do to a human map, and a new identity hardens Numunu the Comanche. Mobility becomes more than a tactic. It becomes a definition, the way a river defines its own valley without asking permission. You learn the Comanche saddle is often no saddle at all, or a pad and rawhide rig so spare it makes a modern bike seat look luxurious. Balance replaces furniture. A youth grows up with legs that understand a pony's center of gravity the way your hand understands a doorknob. You practice shooting while moving until the arrow leaves at the bottom of the horse's stride, when everything hangs an instant like a paused breath. Bows shrink to fit the job, short sinew-backed, viciously quick, from a hanging seat on the horse's offside. You hook a knee over the withers, let your body fall to the shielded flank, and your enemy sees a riderless pony until the arrow arrives from under the animal's neck. Lances lengthen for the charge, rawhide thongs loop to wrists so they do not get left behind in momentum's argument. Later firearms enter the story. You keep them sure, but powder hates rain and reloads hate panic, so bows keep their membership cards. Herds are wealth you can ride. A camp moves with hundreds of horses spares for speed mares, with foals for the future hard ones, for fighting each animal a savings account that eats grass and pays out in reach. Night pickets stand downwind to catch a whiff of trouble before it's a shape. Ropes hobbles and a quick hand keep chaos from cascading. Have you ever watched a skilled bike messenger slide through city traffic like water finding its level? Think that translated into hooves and horizon. Territory earns a name, Comancheria. It swells and shrinks across what maps now call Texas Panhandle, eastern New Mexico, western Oklahoma, southern Colorado, more a weather system than a border organized around water bison. Winter havens, like Palo Duro Canyon, and trade routes that thread to Taos and Chihuahua. Spanish ranches learned to measure security not in walls, but in how much warning dust gives you. Mexican states keep ledgers where losses due to raid becomes a depressing column. Texans take note and sleep in shifts. Raiding is not random, it's schedule and calculus. Spring and summer bring bison. Autumn can bring long rides south for horses, goods, and leverage. Winter means canyons, shelter, and rest when the grass stops volunteering. Parties form fast, peel off, recombine like a peloton that splits in a crosswind and merges again when the road bends. Scouts go in ones and twos, reading distant riders by dust height, counting remounts tied off behind saddles, sniffing for the iron smell of gun barrels that warmed in the sun. Allies and rivals shuffle the deck. Kiowa friendship runs deep, and the two fight together with a rhythm you hear in shared camps and braided plans. Ute and Wichita can be enemies or trading partners depending on the moon and the math. Spain calls, pleads, bargains, threatens. Mexico inherits the same puzzle. The Republic of Texas tries bravado and treaties sometimes on the same Thursday. The United States will show up late to this party with dragoons and paperwork. Meanwhile, Comanche speakers discuss routes, rumors, and horseflesh in a language tuned for weather and angles. Names step forward and then step back, because this is a culture that prizes deeds over speeches. Pennateca leader Buffalo Hump organizes a thunderous answer after a diplomatic betrayal in San Antonio. Quanah grows up on the hard edge of the Quahati, moving like someone who trusts only proven ground. 10 Bears speaks with a gravity that sounds like the prairie itself is translating for him. You jot names because modern brains like lists, but you understand the deeper point: the power lives in the competence of the many. Tactics look simple until you try to copy them. Feints draw riders out. A screen of dust hides a kite-shaped formation that closes like a folding fan. A sudden wheel left or right tests whether the other side can pivot under stress. You practice shooting backward over your horse's tail because you don't always get to pick the direction of courage. A favorite trick is to pretend exhaustion and then with fresh remounts turn the chase inside out. Ever played tag with a younger cousin who has 10 times your stamina? Welcome to the prairie's lesson plan. Economy rides with war. Trade fairs near Taos on the Arkansas and elsewhere see Comanchero middlemen moving blankets, guns, tools, captives for adoption or ransom, and herds measured by the acre, not the head. Ranchers learn to negotiate as much as they fight. Governors learn that gifts can cost less than punitive expeditions. Towns keep a wary ear open for distant drumming hooves, the way coastal towns watch the sky for hurricane color. The ledger of fear is messy, yet the underlying logic remains mobility multiplied by information. Information is a superpower. Signal fires answer across ridges. A rider covers a day's walk before noon. A woman in camp notes the missing mare and deduces which cousin left early, which direction, and why. Children listen to elders mark a creek crossing by a cottonwood shaped like a bent finger, and will find it years later after a windstorm has taken the top, because the bend is still there if you know where to look. You keep a mental map the size of a small country and trust it more than anything printed in a faraway city. Even opponents develop a haunted respect. Spanish soldiers adapt ride in deeper files, try to anchor to wagons. Texan ranger learn to shoot from the saddle and aim at the horse first. U.S. cavalry experiments with repeating arms and scouts who know the smell of buffalo wallows after rain. Yet for decades, the Comanche remain the standard by which others measure whether a plan is brave or reckless. When travelers along the Santa Fe Trail whisper a certain people's name with that particular mix, admiration salted with dread, you understand the reputational gravity at work. You keep your details honest and small because that's where the truth lives. Horse care first always hooves, checked girths, retied rawhide, softened with a little water, and elbow. Bowstrings protected from dew. Meat thin sliced to dry on travel racks because a fast force is a fed force. No heroic speeches at bedtime. Just hobbles set right and a last look at the stars to judge wind by how smoke leans from the fire. Do you double-check your door locks at night without making a big deal of it? That. By dawn, the prairie has changed clothes and a line of riders sketches itself against a pale sky. You test the bow with a small pluck shift your weight so the pony reads your plan and feel the leather bite of the rein settle into your fingers while the grass leans the way a good day leans. The grass thins to thorn and stone wine dries into a blade, and your pony's hoofbeats trade thump for clack as the ground breaks into mesas and canyons that hoard their own shadows. Out here, the word for distance is trickster. The word for cover is whatever you can carry. You learn quickly that in Apache country, Apacheria, the land itself, is a teammate that doesn't waste breath. You travel lighter than you thought possible. A roll of mezcal roasted and pounded into cakes, a strip of dried meat, a skin of water, a pouch of parched corn or acorn meal. If luck is kind enough to move fast, not enough to make you lazy. Sandals plaited from yucca or soft-soled moccasins whisper over rock. When the sun goes high, you follow the shadow line of boulders the way city walkers hug building shade. Camps are brush wiki-ups. You can raise or drop in a blink, always with two exits, the steep one the unfamiliar will avoid, and the steeper one you prefer. Tactics begin with not being where trouble expects. One or two riders appear, turn their backs in perfect rudeness, and lope away just slowly enough to irritate pursuit. The rest wait in a cut under a lip behind a stand of juniper. The ground does the ambush math if you place people where gravity will help. Ridges become tripwires. Arroyos develop sudden opinions about where a horse should or should not step. You throw a few rocks down a scree to sound like a hasty retreat and see who takes the bait. Ever watch someone speed up just because the elevator door starts closing? Same reflex scaled to a canyon. Tracking and counter-tracking are their own chessboard. You cross bedrock to give footprints a lunch break. You brush out sign with a yucca frond. You walk in a friend's steps to have the story. Some accounts claim reversed moccasins to flip the tale of direction, believable in short stretches, impractical as a lifestyle. So you file it under things that might work once, because the real trick is the surprise. You also know when to leave a trail on purpose, a set of obvious prints that sends pursuers into the long way around while you take the short. Scouts climb because information likes altitude. A single watcher on a basalt knob can read two valleys at once by dust plumes, bird behavior, and that odd quiet when deer look in the same direction too long. Smoke signals show up in some memories, and reports thin, deliberate, brief, but you respect how risky they are. A better message is a fast runner, with lungs trained by childhood errands that were really conditioning. Do you glance at a weather app before stepping out? The watcher on the ridge is your older, tougher notification bar. Weapons speak the language of reuse and upgrade. Bows stay in the story, short sinew-backed, fast at close range, but once trade routes cough up muskets and later liver guns, you adopt what works without ceremony. A rifle cut down rides more easily through brush. Ammunition lives in pouches, sewn to be found in the dark. Lances and long knives still have their place when a fight tightens, and a throwing stick has a way of turning a rabbit into dinner without waking the neighborhood. The rule is not romance. The rule is reach, plus silence chosen for the ground you're on. Your teachers have names that the borderlands never forget. Cohesive, unhurried. Cochise turns negotiation and war into twin tools and knows when each belongs in the hand. Victorio moves his people through mountain corridors like water that refuses dams. Nana rides out in his 70s with the calm of a man who knows how far a day can stretch if you believe in knees and careful rations. Lozen, a woman whose presence steadies others, trusts her visions for direction, the way you trust a compass you've checked against the sun. Goyawe Geronimo becomes famous to outsiders because headlines like simple nouns, but you keep the plural in mind. Leaders, bands, relatives, choices made under pressure. Raiding and trading interleave like fibers in a rope. Horses are a moving treasury mules, the all-terrain savings account. Settlements on both sides of a later border become sources for cloth tools and yes stories that travel faster than wagons. Spanish presidios adapt with patrols that start earlier and end later. Mexican towns petition governors for gifts and troops. U.S. columns learn to hire Apache scouts because no map can outvote a person who knows which canyon holds water 3 days after rain. It's not hypocrisy. It's pragmatism. Some Apache fight the columns. Some guide them. Many do both across a lifetime. Because survival is a complicated syllabus. Food strategy is quiet brilliance. Mezcal pits roast agave hearts until they surrender sweetness and shelf life. Acorns lose their bitterness under the right water. Prickly pear pads and fruits become meals once the spines are argued with. You carry a little salt, a little meal, and trust the land for the rest. A fast force doesn't cook a lot of stews. It chews thoughtfully and keeps moving. Modern ultralight campers would nod, then probably ask for seasoning. You would smile and show them where the good piñon cones are. Water is the real general. Tinajas, those stone basins that hoard rain on flat rock, become holy names you whisper to your children, so they remember. Seep lines on canyon walls mark where to scrape and wait. You learn to read the green cottonwood willow as a promise rather than a coincidence. You time travel by temperature. Move at first light. Sleep in the heat. Move at dusk. Listen at night. One sip early, not three, because your tomorrow self deserves a say. Ever rationed your phone battery at an airport with no outlets? Same principle, just with life on the other end of the bar. Encounters with other nations require a different set of nerves. Oodom to the west, Pueblo neighbors to the north, Dine to the near north and west Comanche and Kiowa to the northeast, relation shift by season insult and opportunity. Trade can be peace. Peace can be a pause can be wisdom. The stereotype of always raiding misses the everyday reality of visiting, arranging marriages, borrowing designs, and learning songs the way streams learn each other's beds after flood time. Psychology drives as hard as horses do. You choose the time storm morning chill, a moonlight thin enough to sharpen edges, and you keep the contact short. Hit speak your warning by action. Leave before revenge finds its boots. You prefer to be a rumor's source rather than its subject. Does that sound unromantic? Good. Romantic plans sleep late. Practical plans lace up quietly and go to work. Names on the other side adjust. Spanish officers write reports that sound baffled until they hire scouts who remove the mystery in plainer sentences. U.S. soldiers in wool discover what heat does to intention and what a dry gulch does to a timetable. Surveyors grow careful with the word empty. Even later writers who love a chase scene end up admitting that the real engine of Apache fear wasn't any single hero. It was a culture of movement, notice, and nerve that averaged out to hard to catch, harder to surprise. You keep one eye on continuity because somebody has to. Children practice quiet feet not as a game, but as a way to keep the evening calm. Women carry the logistics that make speed plausible. Food, shelter, cloth, these relentless essentials. Elders hold roots in memory the way librarians hold books no one else has read yet this year. If you're tempted to ask where the battlefield is, you look around and realize it's everywhere. Routines intersect with threats at a waterhole, on a trading track, near a spring, where a ridge makes a blind corner. If you want one practical takeaway, you can steal for your ordinary life. It is this: make plans that don't require applause. Leave early. Choose the shady side of the street. Keep a small reserve of water, of energy, of patience, and spend it last. When a moment turns urgent, do one clean thing and move. No speeches, no fanfare, just the quiet competence that leaves pursuers talking to each other while you're already on the next ridge. By late afternoon, the rocks hum. With heat, a lizard flicks across your path like punctuation, and you adjust the tie on a moccasin before stepping onto a slab that remembers the morning's cool. The canyon keeps its voice low, and you keep yours lower still. Thunder doesn't fall from the sky. First, it rises from the ground in a rolling drum you feel in your ribs, and by the time you look up, the horizon is already braided with horse manes and dust. You're out on the northern plains, where the wind rehearses for days, and the grass keeps secrets, and the people you meet call themselves Lakota allies, friends the 7 council fires. Names branch like rivers. Oglala, Hunkpapa, Sihasapa, Itazipcho, Minikongju, Uhenungpa, Sikangu. Camp circles turn sky into compass openings to the east for the rising light families arranged by band horse herds set just where early warning can find them, a breath before anyone else does. You've seen order in a longhouse. Here order is a moving village with an outline the bison would recognize. Horses again, yes, but a different grammar than the Comanche sprint. Lakota riders grow up with knees that talk to ponies like old friends, yet they also fight on foot when the ground says, "Try me," and you learn quickly to trust the ground's advice. A bow rides short and sinew backed for speed from the saddle. A lance leans long for that last length of reach. A rawhide shield takes its pattern from a vision that told someone in no uncertain terms, paint this and remember. Later firearms arrive by trade and capture muskets to begin with. Then breech loaders, then the dreaded repeating rifles, when bluecoats bring magazines. But for an unkind stretch of years, the math still favors a fast bow and a closer distance, especially when you don't plan on giving anyone a second shot. Societies within the nation handle the choreography, the Kit Fox, the Strawheart, others organizing hunts, policing camp order, carrying the first responsibility when trouble scratches at the palisade of grass. A hunt's discipline spills into war's discipline. Riders hold the line. No one sprints early. No one spooks the herd. The chosen turn the bison at the exact right moment, so 1,000 hooves can be persuaded to circle. If you can finesse a moving sea of animals for food without wasting a life, you can finesse an enemy who thinks courage is the same as acceleration. Ever watched a great traffic cop untangle an intersection with 3 hand gestures, that energy scaled to a prairiescape? Spirit is not a pre-game speech. It is infrastructure. A young person takes a vision quest, preys on a butte, endures weather and silence until a dream hands over an image, a song, a direction that sticks for a lifetime. The Sundance is community alignment, a ceremony about sacrifice and renewal that asks a person to meet the edge of pain and walk through it into meaning. You don't narrate out loud what should be kept private. You just acknowledge the backbone it builds and how that backbone travels from lodge to ridgeline. Wakingyong. The thunders stand in stories, like weather with opinions, and you begin to see why lightning spirals on shields aren't decoration. They are reminders stitched to breath. Fear can be theatrical because theater works. A rider crests a hill with a wolfskin flung over his shoulders, mane and hair spiking together, face marked in stark black and white that carves jawlines into geometry. Another swings down the far side of a mount, so he seems to have vanished, then reappears inside the range, where hesitation is expensive. You've already learned about counting coup touch and go. And here, the bravest still risk that tap, because humiliation is a currency with buying power. Someone yells a name known for that kind of nerve, and you can feel the geometry of the day skew an inch toward their side. Names that stick to history's ribs step into your peripheral vision, whether you're ready or not. Mahpia. Luda Red Cloud proves logistics can defeat a fort by starving it of safety. Thashunki Witko. Crazy Horse chooses the quiet path of action riding, with the look people later try to describe as without matted hair, which is to say focused. Tathanka, Iyotake Sitting Bull, holds a nation's center of gravity and refuses to balance on anyone else's timetable. Fizi Gaul reads a fight like a chessboard and moves people into winning squares without fuss. You avoid turning them into superhero posters because the Lakota power is the many camps that move like lungs bands, that braid into something larger when the time asks for it. The famous fights arrive without trumpet introductions, because the prairie handles its own fanfare. At the Bozeman Trail, soldiers draw lines through hunting grounds as if grass were paper. Small victories teach U.S. officers the wrong lessons. Then, 1866 bites them with the Fetterman fight, a decoy party teasing a pursuit a ridgeline that smiled at the decoy, and 90-some men who discovered what an ambush looks like when the ground and its inhabitants collaborate. Later, 1876 leans over the Little Bighorn, where camps of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho gather in a village so large that someone not paying attention calls it impossible until it isn't. Custer divides and charges at a people who have practiced arriving together since childhood, and the result writes itself in a handwriting everyone can read. You keep the telling PG-13 because good history doesn't need gore to be clear. Reputation swells and echoes. River posts whisper that certain riders eat distance for breakfast. Emigrant trails adjust their courage downward when a far dust plume feels intelligent. Newspapers in far cities discover adjectives like formidable and implacable not because they finally understand the place, but because adjectives are how people admit they underestimated a problem. Winter counts those painted calendars on hides. Remember each year as a small picture. When spotted tails band returned with captives. When many stars moved. When soldiers camped in a circle and were surrounded tiny images that add up to a historical memory as stubborn as stone. The horse herd is both bank and library. Children learn on gentle animals that become aunties with hooves. Teenagers learn on the headaches that test balance and temper. Fighters swap mounts without drama because a living archive of speed and stamina benefits from circulation. Night guards listen with their feet. A mare snorts wrong and someone stands. A distant coyote calls and someone smiles because coyotes gossip about strangers. A stallion raises his head quick and everyone nearby checks the same direction as if rehearsed. Do you lie awake at a hotel and still hear your home refrigerators hum in your imagination? That but with hoofbeats tuned into your nervous system. Trade and politics behave like weather that won't pick a season. Fur company men sell and scold in the same paragraph. Government agents promise rations in words the wind finds unimpressive. Treaty councils stack metaphors like cordwood until both sides believe the neatness of language will hold back hungry winters. Some Lakota leaders argue for one road, some for another, and hindsight will be unkind to all the choices because hindsight never has to fetch water in January. You listen without heckling, because anyone who has had to manage a household budget knows how a good plan can still break on a bad season. Tactics weave old cloth with new thread. Decoys still work, because pride still trips pursuers. A dismounted firing line, backed by riders, still puts pressure where you need it. A feint toward the pony herd still forces an attacker to fracture attention. Repeating rifles when Lakota hands get them flatten odds in ways the bluecoats only enjoy consistently after the factories tip the scale. Winter becomes both enemy and ally. You know where the snow drifts high enough to slow a column that didn't pack for the day. And you know which cottonwood groves catch less wind if you have to circle the wagons of your own camp. Your modern brain wants a single key to the fear they inspire. And the closest honest answer is choreography. A fight here is never just a duel. It is a set piece with flexible parts. This group joins, that one peels off, a flanking ride appears, where a dry creek bed runs, a runner slaps a message into a cousin's palm. A singer starts a rhythm others know without being told. Imagine a perfect fast break, where 4 passes happen before the defense even turns. Then add dust wind and a piece of sky so wide it forgets corners. When the bison herds thin under commercial slaughter, a nation's lungs feel too small for the body. When agencies push rations and fences, mobility takes a wound that no bandage fixes fast. You keep telling the story with care, because grief is not an entertainment. Fearsome does not mean invulnerable. Respected does not mean safe from policy. Leaders adapt some sign, some move away, some refuse, some try combinations. The record books won't grade kindly because record books don't raise children. And yet the echoes do not close their own book. Songs stick. Language bends around new challenges but does not break. Riders still gather for ceremony. Shields still hold old paint under newer leather. Winter counts keep counting. You shift in the saddle test, the bowstring with a thumb, and angle the pony so wind and dust conspire to make your outline look like a passing cloud rather than a person deciding which direction to nudge a day. Mist does you a favor on this coast. It wraps the shore in quiet cloth, slicks the cedar, and lets paddles bite water without broadcasting the minutes of your approach. You tuck into a war canoe, carved from a single giant, its prow rising like a cresting animal, its belly wide enough for warriors' provisions and a story or two. And the first thing you learn is rhythm. The caller sets of beat paddles catch together, and the hull starts to hum like a drum that's fallen in love with the tide. The canoe is an instrument, not a vehicle. Red cedar forgives mistakes, light in the water stubborn against rot, and the hull's flare sheds waves that would clown a clumsier craft. Ribs and thwarts lock the curve. Spruce root lashings flex where iron nails would sulk. Pitch seals hairline seams you respect even when you can't see them. A longer boat means speed and seriousness, 30, 40, 50 feet big enough to carry fighters and a few surprises under mats. Have you ever watched a cruise shell glide when everyone pulls at the same inhale? Imagine that, but with crests carved into the prow and a plan that involves landing exactly where the fog thinks you won't. Armor returns to the story, but with wood's accent. You shrug on slat armor, horizontal cedar strips laced into a shirt that turns a blade aside without turning you into furniture. Beneath or over it, tough hides add a final no thank you to incoming trouble. Helmets carry identity, raven eagle carved and painted, so the first thing an enemy sees is a face that belongs to a lineage, not just a person. A helmet brim turns an arrow. The crest turns a heartbeat. Shields are planked, an oval or rawhide stiffened to the stubbornness of a door. Remember those moving doors from earlier, only here they must also catch spray and not turn into bathtubs. Weapons respect both distance and the boat's balance. Short bows work from a seated position. You plant your hips, twist from the waist, and send a shaft that rides the sea air like it's studied with gulls. Heavy spears wait for the moment a canoe kisses a beach or draws alongside another hull. Lances with antler or iron heads reach across gunnels when words are done. Clubs wasters of argument come in yew or hard maple, some with a beaked bite that punishes close math. Daggers ride where the hand finds them without eyes. A rope with a barbed hook can deny a retreating stern the satisfaction of clean escape. Psychology loves a coastline with corners. Crests on prow boards loom out of fog like a carved ancestor polling your intentions. Songs that the enemy didn't think you'd sing at night make the shoreline feel like it forgot what time it is. Painted faces read, as both mask and announcement, you're not meeting a stranger. You're meeting a house, a clan, an old obligation that can paddle. You've learned already how noise can multiply numbers in the head. Here the sea steals half your sound. So you choose the other half, carefully a rattle, once a shout, twice, then the water swallowing the rest as if it took your side. Tactics begin with tide tables and end with nerve. You ride flood to arrive fast ebb to leave faster. You slide behind points where kelp gardens hide hulls like friendly hair. Scouts stand up in the bow just enough to read the language of swell and current. This line will carry you without splash. That one will lift you in visibility you did not order. Kayakers today talk about eddies and backwash as if they discovered them. Your teachers were sea lions and logs floating a little too calmly near a cut. Villages don't pretend the sea is a fence. They build for it. Palisaded promontories, forts perched where a single bad footstep turns into a slide force, attackers to commit uphill on rock that chooses favorites. Angled trenches deny easy charge lines. Projecting platforms let defenders throw both words and things in inconvenient arcs. You hear names for these forts you won't repeat poorly. You'll just say, the map remembers them, because cliff and current keep the memory tidy. If you've ever tried to take the short way to a hilltop and discovered that someone smarter put their door on the ridge, you already understand the interview process. The map of relationships is Title II. Tlingit, Haida Tsimshian, and neighbors fight trade, intermarry settle debts with potlatches that are not parties but engines of social accounting. Captives appear in the ledger. So do alliances and obligations that travel with a crest from house to house. A copper panel broad gleaming Nick to Mark stories holds value like a bank and a biography at once. Outsiders often misunderstand the gift economy as fireworks. You sit through a potlatch and realize it's calculus done with blankets, food speeches, and memory that refuses to fade. When iron and powder arrive, coastal nations do what they've always done, with worthy tools, adapt, and do not apologize. Trade with Russians, British, and later Americans turns muskets and cannon into equals at the council fire with bows and clubs. Powder hates rain. You learn to love bark covers and oiled wraps. Iron heads join antler on spear hafts. Daggers get metal edges that bite longer between sharpenings. The principle never changes. The tool must work in fog salt and wet wood, or it goes back in the trader's skiff with a polite smile. Names step out of the mist, wearing dates like tide lines. In the early 1800s, around Sitka Sound, Tlingit Kicks. Adi clans build a fort the records will call Shiski New Sapling Fort, and make Russians discover that company charters don't impress cedar walls. Alexander Baranov commands from the other side. Kialyan, often anglicized as Catlian, leads from this one, a war helmet carved in raven crest, turning him into a moving emblem. Cannon shout muskets, cough slat armor earns its keep, and the fight slides across beaches and through brush until tactics and numbers force a withdrawal. The point for your notebook is not a scoreboard. It's the way coastal fighters match European hardware with local choreography, tide fort canoe patience, and refuse to be characters in someone else's easy summary. Rating runs on information and weather windows. A party can lift at dusk, ride an offshore lane, and arrive where a village thought the rocks made them safe. Watchers on headlands matter the way. Lighthouses will matter later. Smoke that isn't from supper means the day is about to choose a side. You've seen feigned retreats on land. Here, a canoe that drifts with pretend confusion invites pursuit into a current that was always going to betray the pursuer. Ever tried to help a shopping cart in a sloped parking lot and realized the lot had its own agenda? Now imagine the lot is an inlet, and the cart has men in it who've timed the slope since childhood. If the weather snarls, you don't whine, you negotiate. Cloaks laugh off rain if you oil them right. Fires favor beach stones stacked to make wind behave. Paddles keep moving because a halted crew is a cold crew. Food strategy tastes like this smoked salmon that keeps its dignity dried. Berries hiding summer in their folds, rendered fat that brings back the sun on a dark morning. The sea is a strict supervisor. You earn your calories early, or you don't earn them. Ceremony leans into courage. War songs aren't pep talks, they're contracts you sign with your lungs. A carver adds a new notch to a helmet only after elders agree that the story earns wood. A speaker unrolls a memory in front of guests, and the room tilts toward the one who can keep a lineage straight without mangling the verbs. If you want a modern analogy, think of a courtroom where precedent is sung, not cited, and the clerk's ledger is beadwork and cedar, not paper. Even the quiet logistics sparkle if you look closely. A coil of spruce root rope dries on a thwart, because tomorrow it might serve as anchor line or lash a prisoner's hands, or just tie down a wet bundle of cloaks before weather steals them. Knife sheaths swell a little after rain, so you massage them back into cooperation. Paddles get checked for tiny splits because a split that waits until surf breaks at the bar is a bully you can avoid by caring now. Do you check your car tires before a long drive? Same energy, saltier air. Opponents learn humility the blunt way. Traders arrive certain that a cannon and a cross will schedule the coastline. They leave learning that fog and a carved helmet can reschedule anything. Naval officers sketch canoes with surprise that borders on apology. Mission diarists write about discipline as if they invented it. You smile because you've paddled long enough to know the distance between a plan and the day's opinion. Even later, when steam whistles echo and canneries push a new economics, the old skill set, watch tide read, wind agree, on stroke keeps paying out in the currency of survival. By night, kelp hisses against the hull like a confidant, and you shift your weight to still the little rock that was thinking about rolling underfoot. The caller drops the cadence to a whisper. Paddles climb and fall. A headland slides by as if the land were the part that moved. You keep your helmet brim low, your breath in time with cedar, and your eyes on the thin line where the fog lifts just enough to show the next decision. Landfall brings questions the sea won't answer. Who goes home? Who doesn't? And what a victory even means when people, not things, have changed hands. You've already seen how trophies can be proof. Now, you step into the harder arithmetic, where proof sometimes has a heartbeat. Among the Haudenosaunee grief stands up before strategy does. A condolence ceremony wipes tears, clears ears, straightens throats, a ritual grammar for repairing a community's voice after loss. Then comes the decision you can feel in the Longhouse air mourning war. The aim isn't simply to erase an enemy. It is to replace the missing place at a hearth. Captives arrive with different futures, braided together, adoption into a clan, and name ransom and return, or if anger and custom align death, that's as much theater of justice as punishment. Outsiders fixate on the hardest scenes. You watch the structure. Instead, women of the clan weigh the fate because the hearth is their jurisdiction, and the choice is about mending, not spectacle. Adoption can be thorough enough to bewilder later historians. Mary Jemison, taken in the 1750s and adopted by Seneca families, grows into Dehewe Mies and lives her life as Seneca, speaking for her community with the confidence of a person who belongs to it. Mary is not alone in the archive of reversals. Francis Slocum, with the Lenape John Tanner, with Odawa, and Ojibwe people whose English names go faint while new names learn to stand. You can argue philosophy on identity. The daily proof is simpler. who fetches water with you, who jokes with you, who grieves with you. Not every path softens. Some eastern towns require a captive to run the gauntlet, a corridor of blows that is part test, part vent, for communal anger, part public threshold. It reads severe to modern eyes. Still, the logic is consistent. If you live here now, you enter here, under our rules, having paid a price that turns tomorrow's resentments down a notch. The same longhouse that welcomes also remembers. The belt gets hung in the proper place. The story gets stored bead by bead so no one has to improvise meaning later. Across the plains, the ledger looks different, but rhymes. Raids gather horses, goods, and sometimes people. Outcomes range from ransom to adoption to bargaining chips in diplomacy that rides with the seasons. Cynthia Ann Parker becomes now-to-found inside a Comanche camp, marries, raises children, and embodies the way belonging follows care more than paperwork. Herman Lehman taken young moves through Apache and Comanche years, and later writes down a life that refuses to collapse into a simple before and after. You ask yourself the impolite but useful question: if a child laughs easiest in one language, where is home tonight? Down in Apacheria, captives figure in an economy of survival that confuses armchair moralists. Some are ransomed quickly, cloth animals tools because a fast trade beats a slow feud. Some are adopted because families need young shoulders for tomorrow's trails. Some end badly because raids escalate and grief backcharges interest. Leaders negotiate across the same fire where plans were made the night before. A kin group that took one person may protect another. A scout who hunted you last year may fetch a cousin home this year because lines out here are practical, not theatrical. It isn't hypocrisy, it's desert math. On the northwest coast, captivity wears the stamp of a maritime economy. Warfare and raiding can feed a slave system where captives become labor status and at times currency within potlatch politics. A person might be kept traded ransomed, or in grim seasons, killed less as random cruelty and more as hard enforcement of reputations in a world where a house's honor is an asset you can bankrupt by neglect. Yet even here, the record refuses to be tidy. Some captives are folded into households that treat them as kin. Some buy freedom. Some are freed as part of a host's public generosity at a potlatch. If you've ever watched a modern corporation mix salary stock and prestige into one offer, you've glimpsed how value travels in more than one form. Ritual keeps the emotional books balanced where ledgers can't. The Haudenosaunee condolence strings you saw earlier have coastal analogs, speeches, gifts, names bestowed to heal a hole in the social fabric. A Tlingit or Haida crest might sponsor a transfer that says we end this debt here, and the words matter because they've been polished against memory for generations. On the plains, a song can declare a captive's new name. In the Southwest, a morning's quiet chores can mean more than ceremony. Is there anything more persuasive than routine that includes you without fanfare? Europeans and Americans complicate the story by adding markets for people in every direction. In the 17th century, Southeast colonists in Carolina turned indigenous captives into exports for West Indian plantations. Spanish raids pull Pueblo and Apache people into New Mexico's forced labor systems. Borderlands become a shuffling board of seizure and ransom that makes every piece feel provisional. Later, captivity narratives become a genre that sells fear, with footnotes often flattening entire nations into a single night's terror. You read them with one eyebrow raised, and then cross-check with the testimonies of adopted people who refuse to leave when rescued, because a single voice can be honest and still be incomplete. Even when a return happens, it rarely looks like a curtain call. Olive Oatman bears Mojave chin tattoos that announce who saved and kept her. Back in the American towns, the marks spark curiosity that has more to do with gossip than understanding. Frances Slocum's kin find her decades later living well in a Lenape, Miami world she prefers. John Tanner's memoir can't make two different loyalties line up neatly. Neither can Herman Lehman's. The lesson for your everyday toolkit is modest identity is built like a lodge log by log, with whoever shows up to raise frame and stays through winter. These fates aren't uniform, because no nation is a monolith. Some Cherokees and Creeks, entangled in the southeast slave trade, sell captives to coastal brokers while also adopting others across clan lines. Some Lakota bands lean toward ransom with certain enemies, and toward retaliation with others, depending on last season's balance sheet of loss. A Comanche camp might treat one captive child as future family and another as future leverage. A decision isn't random so much as situated: who died, what was promised, what the camp needs, what message must be sent to neighbors who are counting your choices like coin. Law lives in the interstices. Wampum belts don't just recall treaties. They also carry the memory of who was returned and why. A calumet smoked at an agreed crossing obliges both sides to behave, even if yesterday ended in shouting. A copper plate lowered and raised at a potlatch says the account is settled for now. On trail, a white flag tied to a lance or a robe held high can begin a parley about people rather than things. You can almost hear the collective exhale when for once everyone agrees to hand fear back to the night. For warriors, the consequences travel home in the quiet moments. A night watch listens for a child's new laugh in the lodge across the way and marks the sound as success. A woman measures whether the young person she argued to adopt is eating well 2 moons later. An elder tests the newcomer's memory for names because memory is a kind of citizenship. An enemy's family somewhere else sits at their own fire, counting who returned and who did not. You don't need a historian to tell you what that wait feels like. Anyone who has navigated a messy family reunion understands. If you want to keep your comparisons clean in modern emergencies, responders triage, save, stabilize, transfer. The triage here is social. Adopt when the community can carry it. Ransom when a future relationship needs a bridge. Punish when the calculus of deterrence demands it. None of this fits on a t-shirt. All of it fits in the space where law, grief, and survival share a stool and decide what tomorrow costs. By the time the fire sinks to coals, negotiations have a shape: a child asleep under a fresh name, a rope cut because the price was met, a belt rehung in its place, a watcher outside adjusting the night's story by the sound of 2 voices instead of 1. Somewhere nearby, water taps a log with the same patient rhythm you heard on the canoe's thwart. Fear leaves footprints. Respect builds roads. Which path are you following when the drum rolls out across the fairgrounds and every hair on your arm behaves like it remembers something older than your bones? You stand at a summer powwow where dust smells sweet, and the MC's voice floats like a kite string over camp chairs and fry bread lines. Veterans carry the flags, the United States tribal nations, POWMIA. And the people rise not out of habit, but out of memory, because service has been a constant through the fiercest centuries. You've learned how war once meant ambush lines and river bends. Now you see uniforms and ribbon vests sharing a circle, the old discipline turned into public steadiness. Ever felt your chest line up to a beat You didn't plan to honor that. The legacies are everywhere once your eyes adjust. A Lakota star quilt spreads like a low sunrise around the shoulders of someone returning from boot camp or basketball state, the same geometry that once hung behind a leader who had to speak calmly about winter rations and moving camps. Haudenosaunee singers lean over water drum and horn rattle their voices stacked with the same patience that governed councils when wampum belts were the minutes, not the souvenirs. Creators game steps onto a grass-field lacrosse, sharp, with quick sticks and ambush angles you already know from forest paths. The Haudenosaunee Nationals fly to play with passports stamped by their own confederacy, and every no-look pass reads like a flanking move that forgot to apologize for being beautiful. Museums try to be careful, rooms now. A belt of wampum sits under low light with more warning labels than a chemistry lab, not because it is fragile, but because the meaning is still alive, and the permission to use it belongs to a nation, not a display case. A Tlingit at you. Clan-owned regalia returns home after a negotiation that felt like weather. Elders unwrap it as if the fog itself were learning manners. You can love an object's carvings and still remember it's a deed of title in a biography, not a trinket. If your family's photo album lived in a stranger's house, how would you want visitors to behave? Names survive with edges intact. Lozen rides out of the page and into murals and classroom lessons not as a mascot, but as a map for courage, a mind that scouts, and a body that keeps pace. Red Cloud's calm logistics become case studies for cadets who have never slept on the high plains. Crazy Horse's quiet becomes a dare to every talkative committee meeting you've ever suffered. Sitting Bull's steadiness turns up in speeches at schools where kids practice introductions in 2 languages. Catleon's carved helmet still appears in certain heads at certain beaches. When fog presses low, a reminder that cedar can be both armor and ancestor. Some of the old skills just changed uniforms. Silence that once made an ambush work becomes code that saves convoys. Navajo code talkers push messages across Pacific battle maps while enemies scratch their heads. Comanche code talkers key orders on a beach in France so fast that the rhythm feels like a powwow song translated into wire. Say, tank, a commander says. Turtle, a code talker, replies. The old habit of naming exactly what you see becomes a new habit of naming what someone else must not. Do you ever rename a file on your laptop so only you can find it quickly? Same trick, higher stakes. Horse nations are still horse nations, even when the parking lot is gravel. Indian relay sends riders bareback around a track, leaping from one horse to the next in a sprint that feels like the Comanche and Lakota archives decided to write a present tense sentence. Kids in ribbon shirts learn sit deep. Look where you're going. Breathe with the stride, which is just another way of saying, don't let panic pick your next move. Somewhere behind the grandstand, a teenager tapes a cracked hoof and does it right the first time because speed is expensive when you waste it. On the northwest coast, cedar still breathes. Canoe journeys stitch shorelines back together one stroke at a time. Tlingit, Haida, Heiltsuk, Nucha, North Coast. Salish crews reading tide rips and eddies the way their grandparents read them when a carved prow meant business. Helmets and slat armor visit only on special days, but the knowledge that made them useful, timing teamwork weather sense, runs in the same muscles that lift paddles into fog. The call and response from bow to stern is the softest form of command you've ever heard, and it works better than shouting. Even the jokes carry history without wrecking the mood. Someone quips about counting coup on the dance judges, and everyone laughs because the humor lands on shared ground nerve measured by touch, not damage. A kid ducks between chairs with a toy bow, and a grandmother corrects his grip, then tells a story about how strings hate rain. The lesson is technical. The delivery is love. Have you noticed how ordinary instruction hold this tie, that listen ends up doing most of the work of cultural survival? Sovereignty sounds less like a legal seminar and more like logistics that learn to smile. A tribal council hashes out fisheries rules with the same composure the Haudenosaunee once used to polish the covenant chain. A community school debates which language classes run at 8 a.m. and which at 10 because teenage brains are not morning birds. The decision matters as much as any treaty ratification when identity is taught in verbs. A veteran at the microphone asks for a moment to honor those who didn't come home, and the quiet that follows feels like a palisade no one had to build with logs. Your modern life keeps handing you analogies, and you keep choosing only the ones that behave. A pick and roll in basketball is just a decoy that frees a shooter where eyes weren't. A perfect fast break is a mounted charge with good manners. An ultralight backpacker's kit is the overlooked cousin of a raiding loadout that refuses to carry anything it can't fix with heat sinew or a patient hand. If you've ever watched a stage manager call cues so precisely that a show looks inevitable, you've seen an echo of how a well-run war party felt from the inside. There's no tidy moral staple to any of this. The legacies include grief that keeps its code on place, names that feel like someone else's handwriting museum, labels that lag behind what a community prefers to say about itself, records that cut heroes out of their own photos. Yet the continuities refuse to dim. Winter counts keep adding pictures. Dancers step in when the drum starts, not because a syllabus told them to, but because feet remember. Kids learn to read tracks in Snowbank and smartphone app, swapping the same grins you saw on a ridge when a watcher pointed at dust and everyone understood. You multitask your attention the way your teachers did. On one side of the grounds, a language teacher writes a sentence whose grammar hides good gossip. On the other, a singer oils a drumhead so it won't sulk in humidity. At the edge of the parking lot, someone ties down cedar planks that will become a small house display next winter, sketching a crest with a finger to show where the story goes. A lacrosse stick